Everybody, and good afternoon from London. I know we have people joining us from all around the world, so good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us from. And welcome to this Global Government Forum webinar, looking at the trends that will define the work of government in 2023. I'm Siobhan Benita, I'm Global Government Forum's event moderator, and in this session, myself and Global Government Forum's executive editor, Richard Johnson, will set out some of the big issues that governments around the world will be dealing with in the year ahead. There's a lot to discuss. The Collins English Dictionary's word of the year for 2022 was permacrisis, defined as an extended period of instability and insecurity. And there's little sign that things are going to settle down in 2023. The inflation and cost of living crises in many countries could become a full-blown global recession in 2023, and governments will need to be agile in their response. Add to that the urgency of embedding action to tackle climate change and the continuing need to improve public services for citizens, and the in-tray for public servants in 2023 remains daunting. Next slide, please, Raquel. Now, in this session, Richard and I will share some of the intelligence that we've gathered on the emerging trends and priorities from these issues for government. We're going to cover economy and finance, resilience, sustainability and procurement, and digital and transformation. And we'll dig into how these topics are all interlinked in government. But we also want to hear from you about your questions on these topics. So whatever device you're using, please do submit your questions, your thoughts, your comments using the Q&A function in the Zoom chat. And we'll get to as many of those questions as we can before the end of the webinar. So in each of these areas, we're going to discuss the key lessons that we have learned from across the work that Global Government Forum does, and how we can work with you as our knowledge partners to both share your insights with our network of over 300,000 public and civil servants, and for GGF to provide you with the insights that you need for your businesses. Next slide. But first, a little word about Global Government Forum itself. So we're a media company that aims to bring together public and civil servants to share both their challenges and solutions with peers around the world. We do this in a number of different ways. So on the next slide, you'll see we have a website with all the information that offers officials around the world the information that they need to know. And we offer research, which uses our network of senior officials to establish insights that you need to know on what public servants are prioritizing or want to prioritize. Next slide. We also have a podcast sharing the best of public service leadership from current and former civil servants. I can certainly recommend that if you want to listen. We've got some great episodes on that podcast series. Next slide. We do summits that bring together the heads of civil service and digital and finance functions from different countries in roundtable format under Chatham House rules to have a frank and open dialogue about the challenges of modern government. You'll see there on the slide that our next summit brings together the heads of civil service leaders in February in Singapore. Then going to the next slide, we also offer conferences like Innovation 2023, where senior public servants come together to share insights on how to lead in the crucial field of government transformation. And moving on, we have webinars that help share on-the-ground perspectives on major public policy challenges like the drive to net zero, how to drive government transformation. We do between 40 to 50 webinars a year, and we've had up to 900 registrations for our most popular topics. We can also provide simultaneous translation for our webinars to make sure that they are accessible to as wide an audience as possible. Next slide. There are knowledge partnership opportunities linked to all of these events that we run, and for your company to get its message out to this exclusive audience. We'll be highlighting a few of these as we go throughout the session, but for more information on the full range of opportunities, please contact our colleague, Commercial Director George O'Grady, and his details are there on the slide for you. And to find out more about what we're doing, so you can also visit us at globalgovernmentforum.com or follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn. Again, all of that information is there. But now let's get into the key trends. And I'm going to start by asking Richard to set out the key trends on that first theme, economy and finance. Over to you, Richard.
Great, thanks Siobhan, and hello everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar today. As Siobhan alluded to in her opening comments, there's a lot of concerns about the world of 2023 after a year of permanent crisis, and that applies to the economy as much as any of the other topics that we're going to touch on today. There's a lot of concerns that the lights on the global economic dashboard are flashing red, as it were. Just last week, the World Bank cut its economic forecast for many countries, and warning that global growth is slowing sharply in the face of elevated inflation, higher interest rates, and reduced investment, alongside the disruption caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The World Bank now forecasts that the global economy will grow by just 1.7% in 2023, and its individual nation by nation forecasts were revised down for 95%, so nearly all of advanced economies and nearly 70% of emerging market and developed economies. And in some cases, those nations will go into recessions. So this will have consequences for government, as economic slowdowns require both additional government spending, and the missing growth often means lower tax revenues to fund public services in the future. So it will be very interesting to see how governments respond. In one sense, we've had very recent experience of responding to an economic crisis with what governments did around the coronavirus pandemic. A lot of governments introduced new innovative ways to support their economy during COVID-19, with direct support payments issued to people to keep businesses going and to support individuals. And while the extent of the response to a recession will probably not be as wide as it was to something like a pandemic, it's expanded the toolkit available for government, and I think importantly expanded what citizens think governments can do in response to a crisis. But that response also had a fiscal impact. Many government balance sheets bore the brunt of paying for those responses, and after a period since the 2007-8 financial crisis, when it felt like bond markets were providing a lot of latitude to government, the UK's brief experiment with Trussonomics policies, economic policies of the former Prime Minister Liz Truss, has shown that they've woken up post-COVID. I think there's going to be a lot less latitude given to government's public spending plans by bond markets in the year ahead. And the UK experience, I think, really was a shot across the bows of finance ministries, and it would not be a surprise to see countries responding to the crisis that might emerge if countries go into recession this year with what Liz Truss rather dismissively called Treasury orthodoxy or finance ministry orthodoxy, controlling spending to keep public finances under control, and letting a slowing economy bring down inflation. So all in all, it will be a difficult year for many, and public servants will probably be feeling the effect of that too. The services that public servants work in might not get the funding that they need, and the staff themselves will probably face a real struggle in a lot of governments to get pay rises that are in line with inflation. It's definitely not a new issue to say that governments are facing some real recruitment difficulties, and these are particularly acute in vital sectors for transformation like digital skills, cybersecurity, and artificial intelligence. Last year on Global Government Forum, we reported on governments as far apart as Australia and Belgium, referring to them being in a war for talent in their wider economies. And it's unlikely that war will be won conclusively by governments in 2023, even if cooling economies might take some of the heat out of the labour markets. But there are just a couple of things I want to pick up on here about how governments might be trying to win that war, as it were, or at least tackle the causes, the problems that it causes through recruitment difficulties. One such approach is focusing on recruitment on high priority areas. those ones that I've already alluded to around digital skills, probably chief amongst them, with kind of focused adverts and additional payments to attract people to professions where they are most needed. And the other way that we've seen governments trying to respond to this challenge is becoming much more flexible around hiring and working practices more generally. Obviously, the pandemic caused a step change in remote and then flexible working practices. A lot of governments are still grappling with what this means, but we've definitely seen, we've heard from officials in places like Canada, and we've seen in UK government civil service job adverts that organisations are removing some of the geographical restrictions that used to exist around where people had to be to perform jobs in order to try and get a broader pool of applicants. And that's a very interesting trend that I would expect to continue this year. If you go on to the next slide, please. As we say, all these issues are linked, and having enough staff to be resilient to shocks is a key issue, and that's where I'll hand back to over to Siobhan in a second. But these are some of the knowledge partner opportunities that we have around economic and finance topics in the weeks and months ahead, including the middle one there, which is specifically focused on the role that government finance ministries can play in leading government reform. So yes, as mentioned earlier, please do get in touch with George if you would like any more detail on these or any of the other knowledge partner opportunities that we discussed today. I'll pass back to Siobhan.
Thanks, Richard. So next slide. Thanks, Raquel. So yeah, just a reminder, please do send your questions in on anything that Richard's talked about there or anything else that springs to mind while you're listening to this opening presentation from us. But just to say, we've had two questions in already, just asking if the presentation and the slides or the recording will be shared after this event. And yes, we can certainly make those available to people, so no problem there. So as Richard said, yeah, all these issues that we're discussing link together, and resilience definitely relates to how governments will respond to economic slowdowns. But it's also much more than that. So the pandemic, I think, illustrated the need to build resilience in the public sector, just as it does in terms of the increasing toll of climate-related emergencies. So these crises show how vital it is for governments around the world to be able to respond quickly to change, whatever that kind of change is. And many governments now are taking stock and are working to reflect this need to kind of build in this resilience in their policies. So governments are learning the lessons from the pandemic response. And at Global Government Forum, we've undertaken research asking public and civil servants around the world for their thoughts on how it has affected responsiveness where they are working. I'm not going to give away too much from the report and the articles because we've got a lot planned for those coming up in association with PA Consulting, which we did the research with. But suffice to say, there are some mixed messages coming out about how COVID developed and impacted on responsiveness. So governments are definitely looking to boost their resilience to future shocks. And in the UK, for example, a new resilience framework has been published that, according to the UK government, is built around three fundamental principles. So that's the need for a shared understanding of risks, an increased focus on prevention and preparation, and the development of a whole of society resilience approach. However, the framework also shows the scale of the challenge that the UK and indeed all governments are facing. So it pledges that by 2030, government's understanding of national and local risks will be dynamic rather than static, and will be driven by data and insight where appropriate and informed by the best expertise and experience. But there's a recognition that there's a long time between now and 2030 when, as we have kind of seen and are continuing to see, risks can appear quickly at pace. So there's also an aim that within the UK government, there will be clear ownership of all risks, including complex and catastrophic risks, and that in every part of the resilience system, responsibilities and accountability will be clear, coordinated, and coherent. This framework really does provide a window into how governments are trying to absorb the lessons of the pandemic and how they're aiming to move from spending the most amount of money on responding and recovering to emergencies and shifting that to spending more on providing increased prioritization of investment in prevention and preparation. And the UK is certainly not the only country who is taking this kind of approach. So the government of Canada's emergency management strategy also plans an increased focus on a whole of society disaster prevention and mitigation activities. And in the US, the government has developed a resilience framework specifically related to impacts of climate change. However, so it sounds good, and there's obviously lots of work being done, lots of lessons being learned, but all of this needs investment, needs significant investment. And what we are seeing across civil services around the world is that in response to tight economic circumstances, many governments have actually cut resources across their public sectors. So trying to get that balance between making much needed savings, improving efficiency, but still at the same time driving up service delivery levels. And every year in this age of kind of perma crises, governments are going to be tested on that balance. And 2023 is particularly crucial. It's going to be really important in understanding how these resilience frameworks are bedding in and absorbing the lessons from the pandemic and responding to the increasing frequency of climate-related events. And on that note, that's where we're going to move on to the next session on sustainability. But before I hand over to Richard on the next slide, I just want to flag the partner content opportunities, including a webinar on this issue of resilience that we have planned in the diary for the 23rd of September. So again, if you're interested in that one on sustainability, then on resilience, then please do get in touch with us. Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Siobhan. And yes, the challenges of dealing with climate change are growing much more acute for governments and becoming an issue that needs much greater prioritization in the work that they do. The conclusions from the COP27 climate conference held late last year in Sharm el-Sheikh stated that we're now at a turning point where the government has come together and demonstrated the requisite political will to take on the climate challenge through concerted, collaborative and impactful action. But the turn is to turn those pledges, that demonstration of political will, into that action. At the conference in Egypt, participants pledged to do exactly that on a very tight time frame ahead of the COP28 summit later this year. But the gap between what countries have pledged to do, which is the 133 countries representing 80% of the world's population have signed up to net zero, and kind of the action plans that will get us there is still a big one. And that is, again, it's a critical area for governments in the year ahead. And that's one of the reasons why a document published by the UK government earlier this month was so interesting. A net zero review published, commissioned by government, but nominally independent, looked at how governments can make the transition to net zero. It was led by a former climate change minister in the UK, and it set out a series of steps that specifically the UK government could take, but it did flag that this could be applied internationally to kind of create the momentum and the impetus for a cross-government response to hit net zero targets, which in the UK is set for 2050. I know other countries have different timescales for that. The report's really illuminating in terms of the scale of the problem. It set out that government needed to act in as many as 8 areas, from using infrastructure to unlock net zero, creating sustainable governance structures, catalyzing action from businesses and from local communities, and increasing transparency on the progress that's being made and engaging people. And among its lessons for government, which, as I said, the report author, former UK Government Minister Chris Skidmore, said he hoped would provide international leadership, was the recommendation of a creation of an office for net zero delivery to coordinate across government and place it at the heart of government thinking. I mean, that's a problem that has long bedeviled governments about how to create that kind of cross-government thinking and make sure that it is pushed through even over just parliaments. But with net zero, we're looking much further into the future and trying to create that consistent action. So it's very interesting in terms of what governments are thinking of in terms of the structures that they will need to put in place to get there. There was also a call for individual programs that are linked to net zero to have separate delivery agencies from individual departments to kind of, again, ensure that progress is being pushed on. And as I said, other governments are thinking of how to develop their own mechanisms to deliver net zero. And it's a challenge that many governments face and something that we are keeping a very close eye on here at Global Government Forum. If you go to the next slide, something I want to touch on quickly that is linked to that is, and I think increasingly linked to it, is procurement. Governments are increasingly using procurement policy or looking at how they can use procurement policy, not just for their own operations and what they need to buy to deliver public services, but to set the rules of the game, as it were, both in providing services to government that are net zero and catalysing that action in the suppliers that could then cascade out into the wider economies. We are seeing procurement in governments kind of return to normal after many of the rules of the game were suspended during the pandemic. But the problems that existed pre-COVID in terms of how to make procurement a joined up function in government, which is a long-standing problem, remain. I think there's still a challenge there to make sure governments have the skills that they need to make procurement a strategic asset in governments and to drive not only green sustainability policy, but also, value for money when, as we touched on earlier, budgets are going to be very tight. This is an issue that a lot of international organizations have touched on. The OECD has said that green public procurement can make an important contribution towards sustainability goals, and the World Bank has raised similar points, highlighting that although different governments have different starting points and priorities, green procurement is really something that can cut across them all and help stimulate demand for more sustainable goods and services. So it's really a vital tool in the battle to get to net zero, and an area where we've seen a lot of governments making progress. But again, I think the question is it happening quick enough? And again, 2023 is really a critical year to keep to monitor progress and to hopefully quicken it. Just one thing to raise on the next slide before we return to Siobhan is that we have a specific procurement webinar planned for later this year on the 13th of July, looking at how to get government procurement right, touching on the sustainability issues that I've just heard about, even perhaps more pointedly, and again illustrating how these issues are all joined up together, looking at how digital capabilities can help improve government procurement, and the potential of digital transformation is what we will touch on in our final section. Siobhan.
Great, thanks, Richard. So yeah, moving on to the next slide. Digital is indeed the key element of the delivery for modern governments, and driving progress on improving how technology delivers for government is a key task. This is one of the areas that we probably talk about the most in our webinars and other events that we do. And we know that many areas of government faced great change in the pandemic, with some services moving online in response to the need to maintain social distancing, and new delivery capabilities around government payments, for example, were really developed at speed during the pandemic. However, as a paper by GGF knowledge partner Visa has recently highlighted, and which we will explore in an upcoming webinar, as the COVID crisis now recedes and we kind of gradually emerge from the pandemic, so has the urgency to digitize, with pre-existing cash-based and in-person payment systems becoming the norm once more. So this return to old ways of doing things has been noticed right around the globe. So the former Canadian Cabinet Secretary, Michael Vernick, for example, has told GGF about what he calls the sudden snapback in the public mood towards the public service in Canada, where people went from really appreciating the frontline responders in the pandemic to now a kind of what he calls a grumpy sullenness around public service problems in areas like passports and immigration processing. And certainly in the UK, we're seeing lots of challenges around those kind of issues as well. And the risk is that this snapback also applied to how governments do things. That now immediate jolt to reform has receded. The risk is that digital reform will also move to the back burner now. Interestingly, this is a phenomenon that has already happened before. So in our Digital Leaders Report, again, you can find that on our website. In our Digital Leaders Report, former Digital Chief Kevin Cunnington spoke to 7 national digital leaders to identify the biggest barriers to successful digital reforms. And the snapback from digital funding was one of them that was highlighted. The interviews that he did with those leaders found that having invested large sums in digital skills, strategies and services several years ago, there was now reticence on the part of civil service leaders to do so again, even as the technology required for modern services in areas like digital ID changed due to other pressures on budgets. So this had left many public services dependent on aging, outdated legacy systems. And in our second Digital Leaders Report later this year, we're going to be looking at what this impact has had on public services. Because until these systems are replaced or renewed, the opportunities for true digital transformation remain limited, while the costs and complexity of ongoing maintenance, licensing, and cybersecurity at the same time continue to rise. Now, it's not only leaders who noticed these things. Global Government Forum carried out the UK Civil Service Digital Skills Report, supported by Google Cloud, with more than 1,000 responses from different grades across the civil service. And when we asked them to name the top issues that they believe are significantly holding them back from using digital to improve public services, this whole full range of officials named legacy technology that's no longer fit for purpose, and budget constraints, lack of funding as the top issues when asked what's significantly holding them back from using digital to improve those services. Other significant factors highlighted by the more than 1,000 respondents to the survey included a lack of fit-for-purpose civil service funding training opportunities and a lack of knowledge at the strategic level in government. And this is really an issue that the UK government is fully aware of. So in the foreword to that report, Megan Lee, who's the Chief Executive of the Central Digital and Data Office, said, "I don't underestimate the challenges we face when it comes to attracting and retaining top of the market digital talent in a fiercely competitive environment, or the benefits that could be reaped for the public if we are to succeed in building digital skills at scale." She added that in an increasingly challenging external environment, the civil service is going to need to work smarter and faster to deliver great services to the public and to deliver policies that are precise and impactful. So this is the key challenge, really. There is no way to transform government that does not involve digital, but from skills to funding, there are a number of limiting factors that stopping governments from making the most of what is possible. And this gulf could become even wider as automation and artificial intelligence technologies become more widespread. So as one respondent to that digital skills survey told us, it's really important that public services have the knowledge to understand in principle what the technology does, so that they can identify where technologies like artificial intelligence, automation, and cloud computing can drive improvement. This official said, "I don't need to know how to use it. I just need to know what it does so I can say that would help me." Next slide, please. With all the data from the Digital Leaders Report and the Digital Skills Survey that we've collated, this is an area that GGF is at the forefront of examining and analysing in government. And here are some of the upcoming partner content opportunities around these areas, including, I think, as we've alluded to before, Global Government Forum's Innovation Conference and the Accelerate Gov Conference, which will be bringing together senior digital public servants from around the world to shine a light on how public servants can promote digitalization and transformation. So we really can help drive your brand's understanding of and awareness in public and civil services in the UK and abroad through conferences like Innovation, through our various webinars, and through research like the Digital Leaders Study and the UK Civil Service Digital Skills Report. Next slide, please, Raquel. So just to give you an impression of the reach that our research can have, here's the Digital Skills Report being covered, not just on our kind of channels, but also in the Financial Times, in print as pictured, but also online. And the Government's Central Digital and Data Office also published a blog highlighting the research. And I and GGS Digital Advisor Kevin Cunnington spoke at a Google Cloud Summit in November last year, setting out the main findings of the research. So there you go. And that's all of our themes covered. So thanks to everybody for listening to us this far in the webinar. And as I said, we do now have time to look at your questions. So any questions that you have, please do send them in using the Q&A function on your Zoom. And I will make sure that all the difficult questions that come in get handed to Richard, because he's the expert in all of these things. So if you have any questions at all, please do send them in now. But Richard, are there any issues that you think you would like to raise, just having gone through that, or anything that you think the audience in particular might find useful to pick up on when they're thinking about what questions they might have?
Yeah, I think there's one thing that kind of occurred to me when I was putting together this some of these topics is a lot of these are long-term problems that would have been familiar to people, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So some of them aren't, but or perhaps the polarity of them has switched somewhat. But things like responding to economic downturns or financial crisis is something that government have fairly recent experience of in 2007 and indeed more subsequent to that. Debates around resilience in public services, I think, are long-standing ones, but many governments have over the last couple of decades kind of moved to what you might call kind of just-in-time public services, where there's not a lot of spare capacity. Everything is run pretty hot in terms of hospital beds being occupied, school places being taken up, things like that. And I wonder, and it is an issue that I actually thought we might have seen more change on so far. I wonder whether the pandemic and the kind of world we're in now is going to change that logic in public services, that there needs to be some slack, some spare capability somewhere. You might not always drive the maximum value for money, but if there is a crisis, then you will be in a position to respond to it. I think that's the issue where there might perhaps be change in one of these issues that has been a long-term one. But the points you make on digital and transformation, for example, Siobhan, governments have been grappling with digital and transformation projects for kind of 20+ years, longer than that, since the internet became widespread and indeed before. But I think the key point on that is the opportunity cost is growing things like
Yeah.
artificial intelligence and things like that are going to make any lack of digital skills become more profound and compound over time, and really not take advantage of the opportunities that exist. So that's where, you know, you begin to think, yes, these are long-standing issues, but we really are getting to a crux moment with a lot of what we've touched on today.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Right, we've got the questions coming in now. So let's go to the first one coming in from James. James Story has asked, while you identified procurement as a long-term problem, are there shorter-term targets or deadlines that procurement measures have been set to meet? For example, onboarding a certain number of new entry-level hires or a number of talent suppliers over the next 3 years. Do you want to answer that one first, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I know that a lot of governments, in terms of targets, have set targets around SMEs. They want governments want to spend more of their procurement money with small and medium-sized enterprises. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is around trying to create a more kind of vibrant supplier base, so that they're not, you know, in contracts that when they come up for renewal, there's only one or two possible suppliers. It's about trying to catalyze innovation, both within the kind of supplier base itself, and then hoping that that will spread out into the wider economy. Without looking up the figures while we speak, I think the UK at least has been pretty successful in that, and I know it was something that you mentioned Kevin Cunnington, who works with us on digital projects, did a lot of work around changing the UK's digital procurement in particular. So that's where a lot of targets are being set in terms of kind of specific amounts of money or specific percentages of public spending. There are perhaps what you wouldn't call targets, but the criteria that are used to evaluate public procurement processes are also changing to take account of environmental factors and other issues around kind of sustainable employment practices and things like that. That is something that the weighting that the different competitions give to those factors can vary from government to government, but there's definitely a real move towards taking account of sustainability factors in public procurements, and that's only going to increase.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, we've done various webinars on that, and I think there's definitely in different countries, I think they've built into now their procurement kind of rules, the ESG kind of criteria. So looking at kind of how potential suppliers meet environmental standards that the government are looking how that will help them contribute to net zero, but also I think in light of the pandemic, looking also at the as you say, whether you can spread to kind of communities, spread the money to communities that were disproportionately impacted by COVID as well. So that's certainly being built in different ways. I think in different countries, they are building those considerations into their procurement guidance. We've got another question in from Thomas Goddard, Richard, who has asked, I like this, but this could be a question I think that's been asked for certainly since I left the civil service many, many years ago. Does all this cry for changes in governance structures of government, silos, pyramids, hierarchy of authority, etc.? Richard, your thoughts on all of this?
I mean, that's a kind of question I would love to answer in the pub as much as anywhere else. It could set up an excellent evening's conversation, never mind the rest of this webinar. I mean, I don't think any government would say that they have got the structures and hierarchies right. I don't think anybody has arrived at the final perfect layout and distribution of authorities. So there's definitely particular issues around what Thomas said about silos and areas of government, and getting different areas of government to speak to one another, it's critical that that is improved in a lot of the policy areas we're talking about here. I mean, as I mentioned, the call for an Office of Net Zero to coordinate actions across the UK government is one. Another that we've not quite touched on in this session is data, for example. Government's ability to share data is another vital element of transformation. And again, probably you'd say after what looked like some steps forward catalysed by the COVID response, it might be an area where government is falling back again into the status quo ante. So, I mean, the answer would be yes. And again, not to make this too UK centric, but there's a lot of chat today about devolution in the UK. There's a big conference happening about looking at the future of kind of regional governance in the UK, and that is an area that, as I said, some of these are long-term issues. We've been discussing devolution in the UK for, it feels as long as I've been alive, and probably longer than that. So I mean, the answer is probably yes. This does cry for changes in governance structures and governments, but it's a lot easier said in a forum like this than done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Richard says there, in that, especially when we have webinars on digitalization, one of the biggest kind of prize for change is breaking down those silos between departments, between the legacy systems, being able, as Richard said, to share information and share data more efficiently and effectively across departments. But the reality of that is very tricky for all sorts of reasons, not least money, but not least those issues around data sharing as well that Richard alluded to. But absolutely, and as I say, I think this ability to work in a more joined up way across government is something that I think governments around the world have been trying to do for decades, and maybe are making slow progress, but definitely not as fast as people would like it to happen. So I'm just conscious of the time, and we've got other questions coming in. I think we might have touched on Alison's question already, Richard, but Alison King has asked, the Cloud Compute 2 framework scheduled to publish soon is possibly an example of how procurement is driving sustainability with the carbon reduction plan. Are there any examples, other examples GGF can see in this space?
And hello, Alison, if that's the same Alison King that I know and we've worked with before. In terms of specific frameworks, I don't have them immediately to hand. I'm happy to get back in touch with you, but I think it's the real shift in government thinking towards how you allocate the points in these procurement competitions to put more of them onto sustainability areas. I think the cloud compute framework that Alison mentions is a really good example, because sustainability of technology procurement is an emerging. You may deem it fully emerged, but it's a key area of government spend, and a key area where there is a lot of focus on making it more sustainable. Obviously, not in the government space, but there's been a lot of coverage of the lack of sustainability of things like Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, and having server farms running, mining endless tokens. So technology needs to be sustainable too, and yeah, cloud computing's an area where I think there is a real effort to make sure that we are moving from traditional technology systems to something that is more sustainable in the long term, as well as kind of providing a better service. So I will keep an eye out for that framework. I'd be very keen to see what it says.
Thanks, Richard. Question from Ben Flatman. With regard to digital transformation, do you see a strategic trend towards the use of collaborative work management software, perhaps in an attempt to improve automation and efficiency within government departments?
There's been a huge move in the remote working era and then the flexible working era to kind of collaborative software. We are using one of them now to have this conversation, and I think again it's an area where, despite us being nearly 3 years now into the kind of remote working and then hybrid working era, that governments are looking still to get right. I don't think they've quite hit on the balance of how to make the most of flexible working in terms of people in the office, people working from home, what software do they use, how do they collaborate, as Ben says. I know there's specific kind of software that organizations can use, but even things like, are government offices set up for this kind of collaboration when the majority of the workforce may only be in 60% of the week, and they might be in at different days. That requires a huge change to how government organizes its real estate. Again, I know some governments are further on in that process than others. I think the Canadian government, we had a series of interviews with Stefan Derry, who's the civil servant, public servant responsible for the Canadian public service offices, about how they are changing them in response to the pandemic. And we've all had hosted a number of webinars looking at how different governments are doing so. So it's a really interesting point about that physical space. But the thing that came out in those webinars a lot, even when you start it on a topic about, broadly about flexible working and about office space and kind of public sector real estate, you end up into a conversation very quickly about management and how government monitors the effectiveness of people working from home. It's not to impugn the work ethic of public servants, far from it, but government needs to keep that collaboration going. They need to know what people are doing at any time. And there's a real feeling, I think, it was expressed by one of the people who attended our webinar, Martin Bourne, who's involved in property in the Government of Ireland, that public servants, the people who work in government organisations, have set out what they want from flexible working quite clearly, but the managers haven't quite set out what they need in response in terms of keeping organisations on track. So I think there's a lot to be explored there still in terms of how that can actually be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's been fascinating, again, in the webinars that we've had, is how different countries, different civil services are taking a different approach on kind of the future of work, which, as you say, will have all sorts of implications for how they use their buildings, the software that they need, the kind of technology they need in place to keep connected. And we've got everything from countries like South Africa requiring everybody to be back in the office 100% of the time. So I think Malta, who are doing the opposite, which is essentially you can work from anywhere now. You can work 100% remotely, and they've kind of disbanded all their apartment buildings and made them kind of hubs for people if they want to go in and work. So really interesting to see, and I think there'll be a lot of compare and contrast that can be done going forward.
And just to add on that, we do have a specific webinar planned on the 28th of March, marking 3 years, give or take, of remote and flexible working. Telethon have 3 years of remote and flexible working changed public services for good. When I wrote that title, I meant for good as in permanently, but I'll take the pun and also take good to mean but not for worse, because yes. I think you can have both those conversations at the same time.
Yeah. Brilliant. I don't think we have any other questions live at the moment. So if you do have a burning question, now is your chance to send it in before we close the webinar, but please do. What we've done in the meantime, if anyone's thinking of a question, we have messaged out to everybody using the chat function. So you should have all received details of the various reports and studies and research that we covered in our opening comments, and also the contacts there for George O'Grady, who you can get in touch with if you are interested in working with us on any of those events that we mentioned. Richard, did you have any closing thoughts or any closing remarks? The only issue that I think maybe didn't come up, which I think will be a key issue for governments going forward, but it's probably under the title of resilience. But I know a lot of civil service leaders that we're talking to are saying this big challenge for them is to restore trust with their citizens, and how they can do that, especially in a kind of world where there is a lot of disinformation, misinformation being put out. And what we're finding, I think, even in countries like Nordic countries, where they've traditionally had a very high level of trust between citizens and the government, that has declined slightly, I think, as I think people have got used to, citizens have got used to government solving a lot of problems over the last 2 years. Combine that with a lot of the disinformation that was prevalent during the pandemic. And I think there is a sense that the public have lost a bit of trust in government. And so how do governments approach that going forward? So really crucial that they rebuild that trust in citizens, especially as they start to deploy technologies like AI and automation, for example, where there isn't necessarily the level of understanding and trust amongst the public in terms of what these technologies can do and the potential risks involved. So that would be an area I'm sure we'll be doing quite
I think that's another example of, again, how all this links together. Trust in government is vital to how getting citizens to kind of buy in, for want of a better phrase, to government responses to the pandemic and things like that. But then, we have seen the trust issue crystallize in a number of countries around the development of digital IDs, which, governments perfectly reasonably are developing with the aim of providing better services, but they're being caught up in the kind of web of misinformation and kind of culture war issues that seem to be particularly prevalent online. And it's a constant battle, as you say, Siobhan, for government, but I think there's still a lot of getting used to these new communities and how this information spreads so quickly. We know of a number of governments that have set up, disinformation units to tackle it, or rapid response units to set out government responses as quick as possible. But given the volume of online communication, it's always going to be a difficult battle for government to win. One of our recent webinars was on how exactly this topic, how government communications can gain trust in an era of misinformation. And Alex Aiken, who's the Executive Director of Government Communications in the UK Government Communications Service, said his advice to the six British Prime Ministers he's worked for would be to think about what they want their legacy to be, because then, as he put it, a noble mission as defined by a Prime Minister is essential to delivering trust. Whatever their politics are, if they are setting out what they want to achieve, we are clear about what Prime Ministers and government wants to achieve, Alex said, then it's far easier to construct a story and to demonstrate delivery and have the clarity of the objectives in our communication work. Now, it's not to say that governments that are involved in battles against mis and disinformation are not doing that, but it's an idea in terms of how they can help tackle it if they are clear in their own minds about what their purpose is and the specific things that they are trying to achieve. Yeah.
We've had just a comment from Thomas, who asked one of the questions previously. Could we put in the chat the name of the report that you referred to from the UK ex-minister on how to respond to net zero targets?
Yes, I can do that. If you just give me a second.
Thank you. And we've sent out again George's contact details for anyone who would like those as well.
While I find it in my
That's
browsers,
all right.
there we are. There's the it was the review by Chris
Fantastic.
Skidmore
There you go,
on,
Thomas. The link is
independent review of net zero.
brilliant. Well, I think we're almost at the end of the hour, Richard. So thank you so much anyway for sharing all of that with us, for answering all of those questions, taking all of the questions as well. Thank you to the audience as well for sending in those questions. If you do have any other questions or you want to get in touch with any of us, please do so after this webinar. We've got George's information there, but please do have a look at the website. All of our contact details are on there. So if there's anything that piqued your interest, please do get in touch with us, or any other ideas that you might have had. If you think we've missed any big strategic issues, we'd be really interested to hear from you as well, because there might be opportunities as well there. And I'm sure there are things that we didn't cover in here, as well as all of the things that we have. Thank you, everybody. And I hope we hear from you very soon. Thanks, Richard. And we will see you again at one of our webinars very shortly, I hope. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Yvonne. Thanks, everyone.